Good evening. We got talking about doctrine a little bit now, kind of getting to the point of where we are and what we are, and somehow we got to go way up. There we go, down, down. So we started talking a little bit about how we determine doctrine, and that comes a lot down to hermeneutics. Does anybody know what that means? Hermeneutics, right? Herman who, they say? You know, hermeneutics is how you, basically how you interpret the Bible. And, you know, it's kind of how you decide to interpret it. It's a set of rules that you use to interpret. If you vary that hermeneutic, then it varies the outcome of your doctrine, because that's just how it is. It's like a rule. So, you know, how do we determine? Well, number one, command. We talked about that a little bit. And then we started talking a little bit about, no, I'm not going, I don't know why. Then we started talking a little bit about facts. We talked about that and how a lot of things are just factual. You know, we don't question that. There are things that are like tenets of our faith, things that are factual that we don't really credit, don't really argue about. And then we started talking about apostolic example. So kind of what that comes down to is when Campbell and Stone, when they decided they couldn't reform the churches they were in, which was really their first idea, was to be reformers and to reform the doctrine of the churches they were already in, which both of them were Presbyterians, they decided that instead of doing that, they would restore Christianity, restore it back to the first century, try to make the church look like the church of the first century, to worship like that church, to do things like that church. And in order to do that, they decided, well, you have to take the Bible as our only source of doctrine, number one. That's a hermeneutic. We're going to use the Bible as our only source of doctrine. We're not going to go outside the Bible. We're not going to use creeds. We're not going to use, you know, what man might say. We're just going to use the Bible. The other thing, we're going to try to speak where the Bible speaks. We're going to try to be silent where the Bible's silent. We're going to do Bible things in Bible ways. That really comes down to apostolic example. We're going to call Bible things by Bible names. So there are a lot of, that's kind of a hermeneutic. How do you perceive it? And so as they did that, one thing they had to do to try to emulate first century Christianity, or to emulate the first century church, is you have to look and see, well, how did they do it? Well, the only way we know, well, we do know, historically, we know some things, but we know it from the Bible, right? You have to make a determination from the Bible. How did they worship? What did they do? When did they meet? What did they do when they met? All these things began to be questions. How do you do this? Now, you got to remember, when they started the Reformation and the Protestant movement came out of Catholicism, and I think it's something you always kind of got to carry a little bit in the back of your mind when you look at this, is that one thing that churches didn't want to do, and I'm not trying to say this in a bad way, it's just kind of factual. One thing churches didn't want to do is they didn't want to look Catholic. You know, it was just one of them things. They didn't want to look like the Catholic Church. That was a big thing. No images, no, even stained glass, even stuff like that. As they started, they didn't want to look like that. They didn't want to look like, you know, because in a way, they tried to get so opposite of that I think they left some really good things there that they could have took with them, but they didn't want to look like it. So it's like, we're not going to do that. So a lot of things began to come out of that, right? The way buildings were built, the way buildings were owned, the way buildings were designed. You know, a lot of things began to come with that. A lot of different ideas, because they didn't want to look, not just the Church of Christ, but churches as a rule, as they moved away from Catholicism, they didn't want to look like the Catholic Church. They wanted to look different than that. So that was always kind of a thing that was kind of going on in the back of their minds as they went towards that. So when you start talking about apostolic example, and we'll talk a lot more about this, but there's two really good examples behind you on the screen. And Acts 27, and we'll look at that passage a lot more on breaking the bread. 1 Corinthians 16:2 is weak at best. I mean, it's a weak passage. We'll look at that passage. I mean, it's the passage we always go to for giving, but it's weak. Yeah. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine if you take it out of context. It's perfect. Yeah. So, right. But that's something we need to look at, and we will. But it's to go back and look at how the apostles did it, and to try to emulate and try to make ourselves look as much as we can like that church of the first century. Try to recreate that. And so, a lot of times when you talk about Church of Christ, when I first started to come to Church of Christ, a lot of things you'd see is people would say, "Oh, we're the church. We started in 30 A.D. or whatever." Well, yes and no. I mean, that's a stretch. I mean, there's no church been in existence that looks like the first century church since 30 A.D. That's not true. I hope you've seen that over the course of the study, right? The ploy was to get back to that and not. But that faded. That faded away pretty quick. Within a couple of centuries, it kind of faded off. And especially, after Constantine, 325, especially after Constantine, it really, he really changed the way Christianity looks. And it looked, he just changed it up because he made it very Roman. And very much of a hierarchy system and a pope on the top. I mean, it started looking very much Roman at the time of Constantine. You had archbishops, and you had a pope, and you had archbishops, and you had bishops, and you had this hierarchy of religious world, really close to what it looked like the Romans looked like. There was a lot of influence there, right? And so a lot of things, I hope you saw that went on, and so we're trying to get away from that, so we got to go back and look at these. This is tough, silence. I mean, that's probably where we have more disagreement than anything, is this right here, How much authority is in silence, right? We'll talk about that. I mean, because that's a big thing for us. That's one of our hermeneutics, right? We believe that if we're not authorized, then we shouldn't do it. What was the deal? We was looking at Reformation when the missionary society came along. What was the division? Well, there's nothing example of that in the Bible. We can't do that, right? Because we don't have an example. And other churches were like, well, it doesn't say we can't, right? So, I mean, that's a different hermeneutic, right? It's a different way of looking at the Bible. So, if you say, well, silence is authority, then that's your hermeneutic. And then you got to say, well, if it's not authorized, can we do it? But then, like Brent says, like Gary will tell you, like anybody will tell you, we fudge on that. So, a lot of Church of Christ that are way more conservative than us, that take that a lot more literal, no Sunday schools, right? Because there's no Sunday schools in the Bible, right? There's no authority to have Sunday school. It's not there. No authority to have support orphan homes. Not there, right? A lot of things that we don't have authority to do, right? So, we have to ask ourselves how that fits into our hermeneutic, how it fits into who we are a little bit. Silence is a big thing, especially when we talk about singing. Right? I mean, that's the biggest argument against instrumental music, says it's not authorized. Doesn't say we can't. No place in the Bible it says you can't use them, right? But no place did they ever use them. So, once again, that goes back to apostolic example, goes back to silence of the scriptures, goes back, and we'll look at that. We'll look at how that plays out. Because I think that's important. It's a big part of our doctrine. So, we have to kind of examine that a little bit. Church structures, our examples, elder-led congregations. That's our apostolic example of how churches should be, autonomous, elder-led congregations, right? But nowhere does the Bible say, well, you can't do it. You can't do it another way, but that's the example. So, where do we draw that line, and why do we draw that line? So those are big things. Anybody want to add anything to this before I move on? It gets a little tougher now. Context, like Brent says, 1 Corinthians 16:2 is a great passage about giving every Sunday as long as you take it out of context. It works really good. But if you leave it in context, it really doesn't work so good at all. So, a lot of things about context. Contextually, how does it fit? Contextually, how does it fit with everything else? And I think that's something that gets really difficult sometimes. Who was it written to? Was it written to us? Was it written for us? Was it written to us? Was it written specifically to you and me to say, this is what you should do? Or was it written to maybe the apostles only? Or maybe was it written to just the people in the first century only and not to us? Was it written to people that just had gifts of the Holy Spirit and not us? We see their context becomes right. 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 Well, absolutely, you have to. In James 1:27, um, it says, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, is that contextual? Is that a command to you and me? Is that what we're supposed to do? Because if this is to you and me, and we can do this today, then we need to visit orphans and widows and to keep oneself unstained by the world. It's not a bad thing to do, right? Not a bad thing to do, but contextually, James lived in a different world than you and me, right? He lived in a world where widows didn't have sustenance, where widows had to be taken care of. He lived in a world with a lot of orphans that didn't have anybody to take care of them. Well, me and you don't live in the same world. Matter of fact, I don't know that I can go visit. I don't know that I know an orphan to go visit at the minute. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm sure I could find one somewhere, but right off the top of my head, I don't know of an orphan to go visit because we don't live in the same world that James lived in, where parents died early and children got left on the street and nobody took care of them. I mean, it was a different world, right? Different world than you and me. So does it mean we shouldn't do it? Well, sure we should do this. But do you think there's some context in this to the world James lived in and the world me and you live in? Yeah. Right. So you're looking at intent of the passage. Right. And I do that a lot with Scripture. We need to find some orphans, I guess. Right? Right. And in his world, yeah. Right. Right. So there's a circumstance to it, isn't there? Yeah, but see, James wrote this before Timothy wrote, "Widows are widows indeed." Sorry, poor Paul wrote, "Widows are widows indeed." Yeah, hold on one second, Sam. Be there in a minute. Yeah, Ron. Okay. Well, pretty much, yeah. Right. Right. Well, the law has been fulfilled, so we're not under the Old Testament. We're not under the law anymore. Yeah. But that's in the old law. Yeah, but we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. Yeah, so yeah, you're looking at predominantly New Testament worship, New Testament. The New Testament worship emulate the first century church. We'll talk about that, whether or not they used instruments in the first century or not. We have some historical reference to that too. So, yeah, Sam. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of what we do, supporting orphan homes and stuff like that, is really comes right back to this passage. You know, most of the guys from Tipton or Hope Harbor, they know this passage well, right? I mean, that's do that to help the orphans. Of course, a lot of them, like you say, a lot of them in foster care aren't technically orphans, but still kids that need help. And absolutely, there's good to do, without a doubt. I mean, no doubt. And I'm like you. There's always an elderly person in our church, always that needs something. I can give you a couple right now if anybody wants to jump in and help. But no, I don't think it does. But I think we're going to talk about other things. We start talking about social, and a lot of you got to remember, social circumstance is a huge doctrinal issue, especially today. Because when we start talking about women preachers, women teachers, what are we saying? We're saying, guess what? We're in a different social structure than they were in the first century, right? Isn't that what we're saying? A lot of things we do today, homosexuality, right? Jesus didn't say anything about homosexuality, so it must be okay, um, right? Jesus never said anything about homosexuality, so it must be okay, right? And right, and I'm just saying, so social circumstance really plays into doctrine. Now, that was just kind of an example I threw up, but a lot of the things we look at, people can come and say, well, guess what? We can have a woman preacher today because Paul was against women. Number one, Paul hated women, and the other thing is that we don't, women of this century aren't women of the first century, and so now that women being silent, that doesn't apply anymore. So I mean, social circumstance is huge when it comes to doctrine, right? Because we do live in a different world, and we use it, don't we? Well, we own a building. Well, find that in the Bible. We have buses, right? Find that in the Bible, right? Why do we do that? Well, we live in a different world, right? It's easier, more convenient. Well, there's a lot of things we can talk about, but that was just kind of an example. And as we get into some of these specific points, we'll really dive deeper into those ideas. Then this is just to kind of get you thinking about how we manipulate things, a little bit. Um, Social circumstance, contradiction. I think Romans 10:1-9, 1 Peter 3:21. What a great example. People who are faith only people are going to go to Romans 10 every time. Confess with your mouth, believe in your heart, you'll be saved. Right? and say, well, that's what you got to do to be saved. But yet we can go to 1 Peter 3:21 where he says the same baptism that now saves us, not the removal of the dirt of the flesh, but the answer of good conscience before God. We say it's just baptism. Those two passages are at total opposites of one another, essentially, right? This one says baptism saves you. This one says confessing with your mouth saves you. So can they both be right? You know? And if so, then how can that be? And if they contradict one another, how does that work? So contradiction. The Bible can't contradict itself. So, how do we reconcile? And can one be right and make the other one wrong? No. So can they both work together? Yeah, absolutely. But, that's a thing of contradiction. Can be contradiction. Social circumstance, we talked about that a little bit. Social circumstance is a huge thing today. Probably one of the biggest things today that we see. Like I said, especially with women in worship, especially with homosexuality, social circumstance is huge today. Probably bigger than it's ever been. In 1 Corinthians 11, now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions I deliver them. I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man is the head of every woman, God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. Right? Y'all know this passage? But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one the same as a woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it's disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, and the woman is the glory of man. For the man does not originate from woman, the woman from man. For indeed man was not created for woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. "20 years ago, 30 years ago, there was a hat. This church was full of hats 30 years ago, right? And men, as soon as they walked in the door, took off their hat. And today, I see most women don't wear hats, and I see a lot of men walk in here with a hat on their head and don't think anything about it. It's legal in the foyer. So, is that, do we not do that? Why don't we do that? Right? Why don't we do that? Didn't Paul say that we need to cover our heads? Women need to cover their heads? Yeah, but it says if she doesn't have her head covered, she should shave her head. So her hair is not her covering. I've heard that argument a lot too, but it doesn't pan, let me tell you. So what I'm saying, social circumstance, right? We live in a different world. Greet one another the holy kiss. We don't live in the same world. Back then, women covered their head. That was a sign of submission. Women don't submit like they did in those days, and we shouldn't have to do that in here either. In some parts of the world. And so women don't cover their head in church anymore. So why not? Where do we draw those lines is what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to cause trouble. Just pointing out some things, that's all. Sam. So anyway, is that a social circumstance? Well, we think it is, right? Whether we should or not, we do. So why do we think that, right? How do we base that? Where do we base our logic on that? I guess so. He said because our wives don't want to wear a hat. So, that's what I'm saying. It's not as easy as it looks. What I'm trying to say. Right? So, the ground of religious unity. That's a huge thing. Jesus said, I pray they're one. I pray that they're one. Right? And yet we draw a lot of lines in the sand. Everybody does. All religious denominations, Church of Christ included, we draw a lot of lines in the sand, don't we? At what point does unity become more important than doctrine? At what point can you sacrifice for unity? That's the question they were asked when they were doing this Reformation. That's when Stone and Lipscomb and all them guys, that was the debate, right? Sand Creek, Sand Creek Address, you know, that was where he drew the line. He said, we can't associate with these people if they don't do this or do this. We can't do it. We're not going to have fellowship with them anymore if they don't do what we think. At what point do you draw that line and say, them people aren't my brothers, or them people aren't my sisters? Religious unity, right? Paul says, I try to please everyone in every way, for I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. So Paul said, unity is pretty important, right? Unity is pretty important. But where we draw those lines, that's where we divide. So we got to make sure that we draw our lines in the right place, right? Right. So, you know, Paul dealt with that. Paul dealt with Jews. Paul associated with Jews. Paul went into the temple. Paul took a Nazirite vow. Paul paid for a Nazirite vow, right, in the book of Acts for other Jews, right? Paul shaved his head and carried it back to the temple as part of a vow. So, you know, Paul did go align himself with Judaism to an extent to try to do that for a period of time. So, you know, at what point did he, where did he draw that line? I'm sure Paul did. Sure he did. But on the other hand, he did a lot of things because he thought unity was important, right? He thought the way to save people was to be unified and to gradually teach people the truth instead of trying to draw lines and ostracize them. Do what? Yeah, well, Peter, right, you know, that was a huge thing. Yeah, he definitely drew the line there, you know, in Acts. I mean, yeah. So, but I think Paul, with Peter, he was talking to somebody who should have known better. You know what I'm saying? I think there's a difference there. You know, that's a different level of, I mean, I would think me and Brent or me and you or me and whoever in here would talk different to each other spiritually than I would with somebody that wasn't a Christian or somebody else, because I think we should be on a different level of spirituality than people outside. You know what I'm saying? And I think we hold each other a little more accountable. You know, I think, do we seek to please God? I think, yeah, we should. I think we can be unpleasing. And I think we can be unpleasing and not be lost. That's just Rex. But I think we can be unpleasing to God and not be lost. I really do. I really believe that. I think you can be, your worship might not be pleasing, but I think you can still go to heaven. That's just me. But I think I say that for reasons, and I'll bring them up later. I mean, I do have a basis for what I'm saying. I'm not just throwing that out there randomly, but we should want to please God. We should want to do what God wants us to do as His children. We should desire to do what God wants us to do, I think. And do we take the Bible to be our only authority? Well, I hope, you know, because that's all we have. I mean, that's what I tell people all the time. You know, that's what we have. I mean, what else are you going to use? There's nothing else you can use. This is what we have. This is what God, through the centuries, has left us with. You know, we don't have anything else to take, right? This is what we got. So if we're going to say we're Christians, then let's do what that says, because that's what God left us. That's my reasoning on that whole situation, you know? I hear people all the time saying, well, he probably would have said that, or, well, this could have been in there, or, well, this might have been. We know. You know? This is what we got. Through the centuries, this is what God's given us. There ain't no ifs, ands. This is it. So that's what we have. So we got to know. We got to deal with what we have, I think. So does it make sense that God would instruct us on how to worship? I think so. But I think maybe it's not as easy as we think. But I think so. So, you know, I think that we just have to try to figure that out. So, So we take our little set of hermeneutics and we take our Bible and we strike out on our mission to figure out what we should look like. And that's the journey that we have to take, right? So there's a lot of doctrines we have. A lot of things, maybe a lot more than this. But, we have a doctrine of salvation, right? Don't we? To hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, right? Live faithfully. That's a doctrine. That's a doctrine. How do we be saved? That's our doctrine. That's what we believe. If somebody comes in and says, well, I was saved a different way, then we would say, well, I don't really think you're saved because that's not our doctrine. That's not how we see it. That's not. Maybe you need to explain to me how come you think you're saved that way, and let me try to explain to you what I think. Because we have a doctrine for that. Worship. We have a doctrine for worship. We do it all the time. Look at that. Christian living, right? A lot of the Bible's about Christian living. Self-control, evangelizing, teaching, study, prayer, devotion, compassion. That's a long list, right? A lot of things, more things probably in the New Testament about Christian living than there is about worship and about being saved, right? Christian living, how we should live, people we should be, right? God's concerned with that, wants us to be the people we need to be. So there's a lot of different doctrine, and so we kind of have to go and figure something out. So that's a terrible slide, but so we're going to look at communion to start with. 5 minutes, we'll get started. The Eucharist, right? Lord's Supper. We do it every Sunday morning, right? And if you're not here on Sunday morning, we'll give it to you Sunday night, right? So why, right? Why is that so important? That's definitely a doctrine that we adhere to in the church. And we're different from most other denominations in that regard. Most other denominations don't take Lord's Supper every first day of the week. A few do. Most don't, right? So that's something that we're definitely a little different when it comes to communion, Lord's Supper. A lot of times you bring somebody to church with you on Sunday morning and they pass the plate. People that are visiting with you really don't know what to do with it. They really, you know what I'm saying? They really, should I take it? Should I not take it? What am I supposed to do? Right? Because if they've ever been to other churches, a lot of times they never have gone through that, never gone through communion. So they don't know how we do it, why we do it. So we really have to think, why do we? What's so important about it? And in order to really teach this, I've found in my life, we really have to look at Passover. We're going to do that a little bit. I think knowing Passover really helps us understand communion, number one. Number two, a lot of our brothers and sisters who believe in one cup, if they really understood Passover, they would understand what the cup actually means in a cedar. We'll talk about that. And how come that doesn't mean one container for everybody. Okay? There was a debate here years ago. Nobody in here remembers that, do they? You remember that? Many, many years ago in the basement of the old building. There was a debate. And we had a guy from Owasso come down, and we had another guy that was a one-cup minister that came down, and they debated one cup and multiple cups in the basement of the old building. I have a VHS tape of it somewhere if I could find it. And it still worked. I don't know. but I did have a VHS tape of it. But that's one reason. That's why Gary and Donna Lovell are here today, because of that debate. That debate is what made Gary and Donna actually quit going to the One Cup Church and coming here. Now Gary's an elder here. So me and Gary have had some long discussions about that. And so it's, I think you need to understand that. The Lord instituted it, and we know that. Those are scriptures that are very familiar to us. And once again, if you take that literal, it's one cup. Take this cup. If you've ever heard that argument, if you've ever sat through that doctrinal study, that's what they're going to say. In the Greek, it's one cup. Okay? So if you break it, if you divide it, then you're going beyond our authorization. Goes right back to that same argument, right? We're not authorized to use multiple cups. We're only authorized to use one cup. Because if you look at these verses, pretty specific. It says, Luke says, took the cup, gave it, says, take this, divide it among yourselves, but it's still one cup. Divide it among yourselves. We're going to talk about this. It's okay. But it's one of them cases where when you look at that, if you don't look at the whole thing, you think, well, and you're really going to take it literal, and you're really going to say, we're not going to go beyond our authority, then it's pretty plain here, right? You got to have one cup. Pretty plain. But we're going to talk about that. So, needs to be in the upper room. Yeah. Yeah. Right. But once again, that's a place where we draw lines. You know? Now, if they come to worship with us, and they wanted to come down, sit down here and use one cup, I'd be fine with that. Wouldn't you? I wouldn't have a problem with that whatsoever. But they're not going to come do that because you know what? They've drawn that line, and they're not going to sit here with us that use multiple cups. See what I'm saying? You see where we draw these lines, right? To me, they're my brothers and sisters, just like y'all is my brothers and sisters. I got no issue with it, right? But to them, we're not. You see? To some. You getting ahead of my lesson or what? What specifically do you want me to tell you about Romans 14? Right. Well, what do you think? Well, I think that and that's right. I mean, at what point do you not offend your brother? At what point do you, and I think there's a point where education and teaching has to take over. I mean, there's a point where, I mean, I think if I walked into something and they said, oh, we're just really, they were using one cup, and maybe I walked into something, a meeting or something, and they're like, and I wouldn't cause a stir. I don't think I would like it because I don't think I like drinking after people. But I mean, I probably would do it. Just, you know what I'm saying? It wouldn't. I mean, scripturally, like Paul, it doesn't matter to me. Like Paul would say, whether it's meat sacrificed to idol or not, I really don't care. But I think at that point, then I would be like, why are we doing this? And maybe we need to study and see if this is really necessary or not. Because the truth is, we're out of time. We're going to talk about this. But the truth is, the Church of Christ, Christ's church, let's put it this way, okay? Christ's church is worldwide, right? And there's no way that it's possible that they can all use one cup. The cup's divided, period. Right? Got to be. Got to be. No way we can all use one cup. Yeah. Right. Yeah, well, that's what they say, If Christ asks us to do it, it's good to do, Got to have faith, right? But we'll talk about it. And as you see it, as we go through Passover, which I think is really, really interesting, as we go through Passover, you're going to see what that really means. So, and I think that helps to explain it better than any other thing. I think that helps to explain why the cup Jesus is talking about is not one container. It's the cup of cedar, and we'll talk about that. So, oh, good. Okay, so Jackie's home. Okay, okay. All righty. Sounds good. Thanks for your time. We'll take our time and hammer through this. Okay.